The white K9 barked at an empty funeral chair, and every Marine in the chapel forgot how to breathe. Frost stood in the center aisle beneath the soft glow of stained glass, his snowy coat trembling as if a winter storm had found its way indoors. Around him, black dress uniforms lined the pews in perfect rows, medals catching the morning light, hands folded, jaws tight, eyes lowered in the kind of silence only grief can command. The chapel smelled of lilies, polished wood, candle wax, and rain brought in on the shoulders of mourners. Outside, Charleston Harbor lay under a gray sky, the water moving slow and heavy beyond the old brick streets, while a bell in the steeple waited to toll for a man who was not there to hear it. The chair Frost barked at sat in the front row, reserved with a folded Marine Corps flag and a framed photograph of Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer, a quiet man with kind eyes, a crooked smile, and a service record full of things he never bragged about. The chair was empty because Daniel had no family left to sit in it. No wife, no children, no parents, just a few old Marines, a chaplain, and the dog who had once slept outside his hospital room for 3 straight nights after a training accident in North Carolina. Frost barked again, sharper this time, not wild, not confused, but certain. A low murmur passed through the chapel. Someone whispered, "Get the dog." Someone else said, "Let him be." At the end of the aisle stood Gunnery Sergeant Ethan Cole, 34 years old, broad-shouldered and still as stone in his dress blues. His dark skin held the soft shine of morning rain, and his close-cropped hair was neat beneath the brim he held against his chest. Ethan had the face of a man trained to endure pain without letting it spill, but his eyes betrayed him. They were tired, deep brown, and fixed on Frost as if the dog had just spoken a language only wounded souls could understand. Frost had been Ethan's K9 partner for 5 years, a rare white German shepherd with pale fur, amber eyes, and instincts so precise that other handlers joked he could hear a heartbeat change from 20 feet away. He had searched buildings, guarded checkpoints, calmed frightened children during evacuations, and once refused to leave Ethan's side during a sandstorm that turned the world the color of ash. But this was different. This was not training. This was not a command. Frost was looking at the empty chair like something invisible had taken a seat there. Ethan took one step forward, slow enough not to startle him. "Frost," he said softly. The dog did not turn. His ears stayed forward, his nose lifted toward the chair, his breath coming fast through his teeth. The chaplain paused behind the wooden pulpit, one hand resting on the open Bible, his voice caught somewhere between duty and wonder. The flag beside Daniel Mercer's photograph shifted slightly in a draft from the old chapel door, and Frost lowered his head with a small broken whine. That sound moved through Ethan like a hand closing around an old scar. He remembered Daniel laughing outside the barracks with a paper cup of bad coffee. He remembered Daniel kneeling in the training yard, letting Frost press his white muzzle into his palm. He remembered the way Daniel used to say, "That dog knows when a man's lying to himself." Ethan had smiled back then. He was not smiling now. Frost placed one paw on the edge of the chair. The room tensed. A young private near the back swallowed hard. An older Marine looked away, blinking too quickly. Ethan reached the front row and crouched beside Frost, his knees creasing the perfect blue fabric of his uniform. Up close, he could see the dog's whole body trembling, not from fear, but from urgency. Frost sniffed the folded flag, then the worn wooden armrest, then the dark space beneath the chair. Suddenly he froze. His tail went still, his ears tilted. Then he barked once more, low and demanding, and nudged his nose beneath the seat. Ethan's breath caught. "What is it, boy?" he whispered. Frost scratched gently at the underside of the chair, careful, almost reverent, as if he knew the place was sacred. Ethan leaned closer. At first he saw only shadow. Then something small flashed behind the chair leg, caught in the thin blade of sunlight falling through the stained glass. A strip of faded red cloth, no bigger than a ribbon. Ethan reached under and pulled it free. The chapel watched without moving. In his hand lay a child's bracelet, frayed with age, woven from red thread and tiny white beads. Attached to it was a tarnished metal tag, not military issue, but hand-stamped with 3 uneven letters, LUC. Ethan stared at it, and the world seemed to tilt. Frost pressed his nose to the bracelet and let out a sound so soft it was almost a prayer. Ethan knew that bracelet. He had seen it once, years earlier, tied around Daniel Mercer's rearview mirror in an old pickup outside Camp Lejeune. Daniel had noticed him looking and quietly tucked it away. "My nephew made it," Daniel had said. "Only family I had for a while." Then he had changed the subject, the way Marines do when the truth gets too close. Ethan looked at the photograph on the empty chair. Daniel's smile, small and tired, seemed different now. Not finished. Not whole. Ethan turned the bracelet over in his palm, and behind the tag, almost hidden by time, was a folded scrap of paper pressed flat and protected beneath a thin piece of tape. His fingers shook as he peeled it open. The handwriting was small, uneven, unmistakably a child's. "Uncle Dan, when I get brave, I will come find you. Please save me a chair." Ethan closed his eyes. The chapel did not make a sound. Even the rain outside seemed to quiet against the stained glass. Frost rested his chin on Ethan's wrist, as if reminding him to keep going, as if grief was not the end of the trail, but only the scent they had to follow. Ethan looked at the empty chair again, and for the first time he understood why Frost had barked. The chair was not empty because Daniel Mercer had no family. It was empty because someone was missing. The chapel remained quiet, the faint scent of rain and wet earth drifting through the open doors as Frost nudged Ethan gently, urging him forward. Ethan rose slowly, careful to keep his hands steady on the dog's back, and stepped toward the main entrance. Outside, the light had shifted. The gray sky softened as sunbeams filtered through scattered clouds, casting a gentle glow across the cobblestone courtyard. Frost led the way, paused silent on the damp stones, his nose lifted to the breeze, catching every hint of a memory or a whisper from the past. Ethan followed, boots crunching softly on gravel, every step measured, echoing the rhythm of a heart that had learned to carry loss with quiet dignity. As they approached the edge of the chapel grounds, the harbor came into view, a familiar stretch of water that reflected the light like melted silver, waves moving slow and deliberate, as if mirroring the stillness within Ethan's chest. Frost paused beside a worn bench, tail wagging slightly, then turned to look at Ethan, amber eyes meeting his with an unspoken question. Ethan crouched to meet his gaze, the cold morning air biting at his cheeks, carrying the smell of salt, wood smoke, and wet pine from the distant trees along the shoreline. Memories returned in fragments, Frost waiting patiently through nights of quiet vigilance, Daniel Mercer's voice soft but steady, laughter in the barracks, the smell of coffee and sand, and the moments of small triumphs in training yards long ago. The dog's breath fogged in the cold air, small clouds drifting upward, and Ethan reached out, running his fingers through Frost's fur, noting the familiar warmth beneath the white coat. Frost barked once, low, then sat, posture alert, gaze fixed on the pathway leading toward the old family cemetery tucked behind the chapel, gravestones leaning slightly, etched letters softened by years of rain. Ethan followed, heart tight, remembering the first time Frost had ever pulled him through a difficult search, a flash of instinct and trust that had carried them both through long days and longer nights. The cemetery gate creaked as they entered, iron hinges echoing softly against the quiet, and Frost slowed, nose tracing the ground carefully, ears flicking at every distant sound. Ethan felt the weight of absence in every step, a tangible emptiness pressing on his chest, yet he moved with resolve, letting Frost guide the way. They reached a small plot near the center, marked by a simple granite stone, and Frost circled it slowly, then rested his head near the base, tilting his ears to listen for something Ethan could not hear. He knelt beside the dog, fingers brushing over the damp grass, heart catching at the sense of presence lingering in the air. A single flower had been placed at the headstone, petals wet from the morning drizzle, and Ethan recognized Daniel's handwriting etched faintly on a small wooden marker tucked beneath it. Frost nudged Ethan's hand with his nose, gentle but insistent, and Ethan understood. The dog had led him here, not by chance, not by training, but by memory and loyalty, connecting the fragments of a man's life that had been scattered by time and circumstance. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint laughter of children from a nearby playground, mingling with the cries of gulls over the harbor, a delicate symphony that seemed to echo the pulse of life continuing beyond grief. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting the tightness in his chest ease, and Frost pressed against his side, body warm, steady, a living reminder that devotion endured even when the world had shifted. Kneeling there, beside the stone and the dog who never abandoned him, Ethan felt the thread of connection strengthen, a quiet acknowledgement that even through absence, even through years apart, loyalty and love remained unbroken. Frost let out a soft, almost musical whine, and Ethan leaned closer, whispering words of thanks he had never said before, a promise to carry forward the memory of Daniel, to honor it in the small, deliberate acts of life that followed each day. The sun rose higher, spilling light across the damp grass and illuminating Frost's white fur, turning it almost luminous against the muted greens and grays of the cemetery. Ethan rose slowly, placing a hand on the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of a companion who had seen him through loss, guided him through silence, and reminded him that presence could be found in the quietest of moments. Together, they walked back toward the chapel, steps slow but certain, the weight of sorrow lifted slightly by the certainty of enduring loyalty. Each glance shared between them a silent acknowledgement that some bonds could never be broken, and some hearts never truly forgotten. The walk back to the chapel felt longer than it had before, as if the path itself had changed beneath Ethan's boots. Frost stayed close to his left side, not pulling now, not searching, only walking with the patient steadiness of a dog who had done what he came to do and was waiting for the human heart to understand. The mourners had not moved much. They stood scattered beneath the chapel awning and along the courtyard, their black coats damp at the shoulders, their voices lowered into thin threads of sound. Some watched Ethan's face. Others watched Frost. No one asked the question aloud, but Ethan could feel it passing between them. What had the dog found that grief had missed? The chaplain stepped forward when Ethan reached the chapel steps, his silver hair stirring in the harbor breeze. He looked at the bracelet in Ethan's hand, then at the old cemetery beyond the side gate, and his expression softened with something deeper than surprise. "Gunnery Sergeant," he said quietly, "is there something we should know?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no words came. The red thread lay across his palm like a small wound from another life. Frost pressed his shoulder against Ethan's knee, warm and solid, and that touch steadied him more than any command ever had. "Daniel had a nephew," Ethan said at last. His voice was low, rough around the edges. "A boy named Lucas. I think Daniel believed he would come one day." The chapel seemed to lean closer. Rain ticked gently from the roof gutters. A woman near the front steps covered her mouth with her hand. Ethan looked toward the empty chair inside, the folded flag, the framed photograph, and the place where Frost had stood barking at something no one else could see. "There was a note," Ethan continued. "The boy wrote, 'Please save me a chair.'" The words landed softly, but they changed the air. They made the empty seat feel less like a symbol and more like a promise waiting to be kept. Captain Raymond Ellis, an older Marine with a square jaw and kind eyes, stepped down from the porch. He had served with Daniel years ago and carried the slow patience of a man who remembered more names than he spoke. "Lucas Mercer," he said, almost to himself. "I remember hearing that name once." Ethan turned to him. Frost's ears rose. "Daniel had a sister," Captain Ellis said. "Emily. She lived inland, near Somerville, I think. There was a hard family break after their parents passed. Daniel never talked much about it. He sent gifts, though, every Christmas, every birthday, little things, model planes, baseball gloves, books with notes in the cover." Ethan swallowed. Why was no one told? Captain Ellis looked away toward the harbor, where gulls drifted over the water like torn white paper. Because Daniel was proud in the quiet way, the kind that hides pain so nobody else has to carry it. And because some families lose each other without meaning to. Frost gave a soft whine at Daniel's name, then turned his head toward the street beyond the chapel grounds. Ethan noticed it immediately. The dog's body had changed again. Not alarmed, not fearful, focused. Frost moved down the steps, paused at the edge of the courtyard, and lifted his nose to the wind. A faint breeze came from the direction of the main road, carrying the smell of wet asphalt, diesel from passing trucks, cut grass from the churchyard, and something Ethan could not read, but Frost clearly could. "Easy," Ethan murmured. Frost took 2 steps forward, then looked back as if asking permission. Ethan followed. Captain Ellis walked beside him, slower but alert, while several Marines remained behind, unsure whether the funeral had paused or become something else entirely. At the chapel gate, Frost stopped beside an old bulletin board protected by fogged glass. Flyers for community dinners, veteran support meetings, youth choir practice, and a missing black umbrella curled beneath the tacks. Frost sniffed the bottom corner, then pawed gently at a damp sheet that had come loose and slipped halfway behind the frame. Ethan opened the latch and pulled it free. It was not a flyer. It was a photograph, weathered at the edges, as if someone had carried it too long before dropping it. In it, a boy of about 10 stood beside Daniel Mercer outside a minor league baseball stadium. Daniel wore jeans, a navy jacket, and the shy smile Ethan knew well. The boy wore a red thread bracelet on one wrist and held up a baseball with both hands as if it were treasure. On the back, written in blue ink, were 4 words. Lucas, age 10, Charleston. Ethan felt the breath leave him slowly. Frost touched the photograph with his nose and sat down. Across the street, just beyond the iron fence, a city bus sighed to a stop near the curb. The doors opened with a soft hiss. A young man stepped down carrying a worn backpack against one shoulder. He was tall but thin, maybe 17 or 18, with Daniel Mercer's same uncertain smile and the same habit of looking at the ground before looking at the world. Around his wrist was a faded red thread bracelet, newer than the one in Ethan's hand, but woven the same way. Frost stood so suddenly that Ethan's heart jumped. The dog did not bark this time. He simply walked to the gate, tail low, ears forward, eyes bright with recognition that seemed impossible and holy. The young man froze when he saw the white German shepherd. His lips parted. His face changed, not with fear, but with the shock of finding something he had been afraid to hope for. "Frost," he whispered. Ethan gripped the old bracelet in his palm, feeling the tiny beads press into his skin. The chapel bell above them gave one slow, gentle toll, though no hand had reached for the rope. Frost reached the gate before Ethan could call him back, but he did not rush the young man. He stopped just inside the iron bars, his white coat glowing softly beneath the washed-out morning sun, his ears lifted, his body still with the gentleness of recognition. The young man stood on the sidewalk with one hand gripping the strap of his backpack, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his gray hoodie, his breath shallow, as if he had walked into a dream and feared one wrong movement would break it. He looked from Frost to the chapel, then to the framed photograph visible through the open doors, and the color drained from his face. Ethan opened the gate slowly. The hinges gave a quiet groan. "Are you Lucas Mercer?" he asked. The young man nodded once, barely. His eyes stayed on Frost. "I was not sure I had the right place," he said, his voice thin, careful, shaped by a long morning of doubt. "The bus was late. Then I saw the uniforms." Frost took one step forward and lowered his head, offering himself without demand. Lucas knelt on the wet sidewalk, his knees touching the damp concrete, and held out a trembling hand. Frost sniffed his fingers. For a second, nothing happened. Then the dog leaned forward and pressed his forehead into Lucas's palm with such quiet trust that the young man broke. He did not make a scene. He did not fall apart loudly. He simply bent over the white shepherd's neck, closed his eyes, and let the tears come the way rain slides down glass, silent and unstoppable. Ethan looked away for a moment, giving him the mercy of privacy even while everyone watched. Behind them, the Marines at the chapel steps had gone still. Captain Ellis removed his cover and held it against his chest. The chaplain lowered his head. Even the city bus lingered at the curb for a heartbeat longer than it had to, its engine humming softly, before pulling away down the wet street. Lucas whispered something into Frost's fur. Ethan could not hear the words, but Frost did. His tail moved once, slow and low, and he leaned closer, as if accepting a message meant for someone who could no longer answer. Ethan stepped nearer and opened his palm. The old red bracelet rested there, its beads dulled by years, its metal tag catching the pale light. Lucas stared at it. His hand went instinctively to his own wrist. "He kept it," Lucas said. Ethan nodded. "He kept more than that." Lucas swallowed hard. His eyes flicked toward the chapel and then back to the sidewalk, as if shame had weight and kept pulling his face down. "I wrote him letters when I was little. Then things got complicated at home. My mother got sick. We moved. I lost his number. I thought he forgot." His voice cracked on the last word, and Frost lifted his muzzle, touching Lucas's chin with a soft nudge. Ethan crouched in front of him, the dress blues tight across his shoulders, the rain beating on his sleeve. Daniel did not forget you. Lucas looked at him then, really looked, seeing not just the uniform but the man inside it, the steady dark eyes, the grief held in place by discipline. You knew him? He asked. Ethan breathed in slowly, tasting salt in the air. Yes, he was the kind of Marine who checked on everybody else before anybody knew he needed checking on. He talked about a boy who loved baseball and drew airplanes in the margins of school papers. He just never said enough for us to find you. Lucas wiped his cheek with the back of his hand. I came because of a letter. He reached into the front pocket of his backpack and pulled out a white envelope, bent at the corners, with Daniel Mercer's handwriting across the front. It arrived last week. I do not know why it took so long. Maybe it got forwarded from an old address. Maybe someone found it and mailed it again. He held it like something fragile enough to vanish. It said if anything ever happened, there would be a chair for me. Ethan felt the chapel behind him, felt the empty seat waiting with its folded flag, felt Frost's strange bark echoing through the morning like a bell only heaven had heard first. Captain Ellis stepped closer, his voice soft. Son, that chair is still there. Lucas looked past them through the open doors. The sanctuary glowed with candles and stained glass, with polished wood and lilies, with the quiet rows of Marines who had suddenly become less like strangers and more like witnesses. He rose slowly. Frost rose with him, staying close against his leg as if he had chosen his post. Lucas hesitated at the gate. I do not know if I belong in there. Ethan turned toward him fully. The wind moved through the courtyard, carrying the sound of harbor water and distant traffic, ordinary life continuing around an extraordinary ache. Daniel saved you a place, Ethan said. That means you belong. Lucas pressed the old envelope to his chest and nodded, but his feet did not move. Frost made the decision for him. The white shepherd walked forward through the gate, then stopped, looked back, and waited. It was the same look Ethan knew from long patrols, from hospital corridors, from silent nights when grief had tried to make men forget the way home. Not command. Invitation. Lucas took one step, then another. Ethan walked on his right. Frost walked on his left. Together they crossed the courtyard toward the chapel, and as they reached the threshold, every Marine inside stood without being told. Frost led Lucas carefully down the center aisle, the polished wood of the chapel floor gleaming beneath the soft morning light filtering through the stained glass windows. Each step echoed faintly in the quiet sanctuary, a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of their hearts. Ethan walked alongside them, hands resting on his belt, observing with a measured calm the reunion unfolding in front of him. The pews were lined with Marines who had served with Daniel, their eyes tracking the young man as he approached the empty chair that had once seemed so lonely. Lucas's sneakers made soft scuffing sounds against the floor, and the air carried the faint scent of candle wax and damp wood. Frost moved deliberately, his white coat brushing against the knees of those who had stood in silent attention, a living thread weaving past and present together. Lucas knelt slowly before the chair, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the folded Marine Corps flag. Frost rested his head gently on the young man's lap, his amber eyes locked on Lucas as if he were ensuring every motion was measured and safe, that the boy understood the gravity of the moment without fear. Ethan knelt beside them, placing a steadying hand on Lucas's shoulder, his eyes scanning the chapel for subtle reactions, for the small signs of awe and understanding among the other Marines, all of whom seemed to recognize the sacredness of this silent exchange. Lucas unfolded the flag with careful fingers, the crisp folds brushing against his palms, and beneath it, he discovered a small notebook, worn at the edges, the cover decorated with sketches of airplanes and handwritten notes. Frost nudged the notebook gently with his nose, encouraging him to open it. The pages revealed letters from Daniel to Lucas over the years, carefully hidden and preserved, each note filled with encouragement, wisdom, and small observations that only a mentor could pass on. Lucas's breath came unevenly as he read, Frost leaning closer to rest his chin on the boy's shoulder, a steady presence that anchored him in the moment. Ethan's voice was low, measured. As he spoke, Daniel wanted you to see this, to know that you were never forgotten. Lucas looked up, tears welling in his eyes. meeting Ethan's gaze and then Frost's unwavering stare. A bond formed through loyalty, love, and memory stretching across time and distance. The chapel was silent except for the occasional shuffle of a foot or the soft sigh of air moving through the open doors, and yet the weight of all the unspoken stories hung palpably in the space, a reminder of the enduring connections between those who serve and those who wait faithfully. Lucas rose slowly, keeping the notebook close to his chest, and Frost moved beside him, tail low but steady, guiding him toward the front of the chapel where a small crowd had begun to gather. Ethan followed, keeping pace, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, the young man and the dog moving together as one. The sunlight streamed more fully through the stained glass now, painting the floor with hues of blue, red, and gold, catching the edges of Frost's coat, and illuminating Lucas's face as he looked at the flag, the photograph, and the memories encapsulated within the chapel walls. There was no rush, no need for words, only presence and recognition. Frost pressed against Lucas's leg as they reached the front, head held high, a silent affirmation of the journey they had completed together. Ethan stepped aside slightly, allowing Lucas to kneel once more before the chair, placing the notebook and the flag carefully on the seat. Frost sat beside him, shoulders touching, eyes bright and watchful, and the quiet chorus of understanding seemed to ripple through the room. Lucas touched the photograph of Daniel gently, tracing the features with a reverent finger, and Frost lifted his nose to the boy's hand, acknowledging the gesture. Ethan remained near, a steady sentinel, and for the first time that morning, a small, almost imperceptible smile played across his lips. The chapel filled with light, warmth, and the soft presence of devotion, and Frost rested his head fully against Lucas, a shared heartbeat of trust, loyalty, and unspoken love anchoring both of them in the profound realization that some bonds endure beyond absence, beyond time, and that true presence is measured not in hours or miles, but in the constancy of care and memory. The service resumed not with a loud announcement, but with a breath everyone seemed to take at the same time. The chaplain stepped back to the pulpit, his hand resting lightly on the worn wood, and the pages before him trembled only because the morning breeze had found its way through the open chapel doors. Lucas remained beside the front chair, the notebook held close against his chest, while Frost sat at his feet with his white tail curled neatly around one paw. Ethan stood a few steps behind them, his shoulders square, his face calm, but something in him had shifted. The empty place no longer looked empty. It had become a doorway. The chaplain looked at Lucas with a gentleness that needed no explanation. "Son," he said, "you do not have to speak." Lucas nodded as if he understood, but his fingers tightened around the notebook. For a long moment, he only stared at Daniel's photograph. The candles around it flickered softly, their golden light touching the frame, the folded flag, the old bracelet, and the edge of the letter that had brought him there. Then Lucas opened the notebook to the first page. His voice, when it came, was small but clear. "He wrote this when I was 11. The chapel grew still again. Lucas swallowed and read only a few lines, not all of it, because some words belong to the heart before they belong to a room. "Lucas, being brave does not mean you do not get scared. It means you keep walking toward what is right, even when your hands shake." Frost lifted his head at Daniel's name, ears forward, eyes shining with a strange and patient recognition. Lucas drew a slow breath. "I thought he stopped writing because I stopped matching." His words nearly broke, but he held them together. "I think maybe the letters just never knew where to find me." No one corrected him. No one tried to soften it. Some truths are already soft enough because they have survived so much. Ethan lowered his gaze, feeling that sentence settle in him like a stone dropped into deep water. He thought of Daniel in the barracks, ceiling, envelopes under the dim yellow desk lamp while other Marines slept. He remembered the careful way Daniel chose words, never wasting them, never using them to make himself seem bigger. Daniel had carried his love the way many good men carry sorrow, quietly, without asking anyone to notice. Lucas turned another page, and a pressed ticket stub slipped out, floating down like a small leaf. Frost rose before anyone else moved. He stepped forward, caught the edge gently beneath one paw, and stopped it from sliding under the chair. A soft ripple moved through the Marines, not laughter, not surprise exactly, but the tender release of people who had been holding grief too tightly. Lucas picked up the ticket and gave a watery smile. "A baseball game," he whispered. "Charleston River Dogs. He took me once." I spilled lemonade all over his shoes. Captain Ellis let out a quiet breath behind Ethan. "He told that story," he said. "He said you apologized for 20 minutes. Lucas laughed then, just once, small and broken and beautiful. It changed the room. Not enough to erase sorrow. Nothing could do that, but enough to let light in through the cracks. Frost leaned against Lucas's knee, and the young man placed a hand on his head, fingers sinking into the thick white fur as if holding on to proof that he had not imagined any of this. The chaplain waited until the silence became peaceful rather than heavy. Then he spoke of service, not as a list of medals, but as a life made of ordinary loyalties. A cup of coffee handed to a tired friend. A letter mailed to a child who might never answer. A dog trusted with the pieces of a heart no person knew how to hold. Ethan listened, but his eyes kept returning to Frost. He had seen that dog track a scent through rain, through crowds, through confusion. He had seen him refuse easy paths and choose the one that mattered. But this morning felt different. Frost had not found a person hiding. He had found a promise. When the chaplain finished, he invited Lucas to sit. The young man looked at the reserved chair, then at Ethan, unsure. Ethan gave one small nod. Lucas lowered himself into the seat Daniel had saved for him, the folded flag resting. Across his lap, the notebook against his heart, the old bracelet beside his hand. Frost sat directly in front of him, facing outward like a guardian at a gate. The Marines remained standing until Lucas was settled. Then, one by one, they sat, not as strangers honoring a fallen brother, but as witnesses to a family being put back together one fragile piece at a time. Outside, the rain finally stopped. Sunlight touched the chapel floor in long bands of blue and gold. Ethan felt warmth on his hands and realized he had unclenched them. For the first time that morning, the bell above the chapel did not sound like farewell. It sounded like someone had made it home. After the final prayer, no one moved right away. The chaplain closed the Bible with a soft press of his hand, and the sound seemed to settle over the chapel like a blanket laid across tired shoulders. Lucas sat in Daniel's chair with the flag across his lap, the notebook held in one hand and the old bracelet in the other, his eyes fixed on the photograph, as if he were trying to memorize a face he had never truly lost. Frost stayed in front of him, tall and quiet, his white coat lit by the stained glass until it carried colors that were not his own, blue along his back, red near his paws, gold over his ears like morning had chosen him. Ethan watched from the aisle, feeling the ache in his chest loosen, then tighten again when Lucas turned the next page in the notebook and stopped breathing for a second. The boy's fingers hovered over something tucked deep inside the back cover. It was not another letter. It was a small key, taped beneath a square of yellowed paper, the brass darkened with age, the number 12 stamped into its head. Lucas looked at Ethan. "Do you know what this is?" Ethan shook his head, but Frost stood at once. The dog's ears sharpened. His nose lifted. A low breath moved through him, not quite a whine, not quite a warning. Captain Ellis stepped closer, studying the key. "Daniel rented a storage locker near the old marina," he said slowly. "He kept saying he needed to clean it out, but he never did. Locker 12, maybe." Lucas looked down at the key as if it had become heavier. Why would he leave this for me? No one answered because the answer had not arrived yet. Outside, the clouds thinned, and the chapel doors opened wider to a sweep of fresh harbor air. The funeral had ended, but something else had begun, and everyone felt it. Ethan helped Lucas fold the flag with careful hands. The young man moved slowly, learning each crease as though it were a lesson Daniel had meant to teach him. When the flag was secured, Ethan placed it in Lucas's arms, and for a moment the boy looked too young to carry so much meaning. Frost touched his nose to the corner of the flag, then turned toward the door. Ethan knew that look. It was the same steady insistence that had led them to the bracelet, to the photograph, to Lucas himself. "All right, boy," Ethan murmured. "Show us." The old marina sat less than a mile from the chapel, past narrow brick streets still shining from rain and rows of oak trees with moss hanging pale and silver in the breeze. Ethan drove slowly in a black Marine Corps sedan, Lucas in the passenger seat with the flag on his lap, Frost in the back with his nose near the cracked window, breathing in the city. Captain Ellis followed in his pickup. Charleston moved around them with its ordinary grace. Bicycles splashing through shallow puddles, a coffee shop opening its doors, a delivery truck backing carefully beside a bakery, gulls crying above the rooftops. Life continued, gentle and unaware, while Lucas stared at the key in his palm. "I was angry at him for years," he said suddenly. Ethan kept his eyes on the road. "That does not make you wrong." Lucas swallowed. "It makes me late." Ethan let the words sit between them. Then he said, "Late is not the same as lost." Frost shifted in the back seat and rested his muzzle on Lucas's shoulder. The boy reached up without looking and placed his hand over the dog's nose. The marina storage building stood behind a chain-link fence near the water, painted pale blue and weathered by salt air. A faded sign creaked above the entrance. The place smelled of rope, fuel, damp wood, and old summer afternoons. Locker 12 waited at the end of the row, its metal door scratched and "Respect," a small brass lock hanging beneath the handle. Lucas knelt with the key, but his hand shook too badly to fit it. Ethan crouched beside him. "Take your time." Frost sat close enough that his shoulder touched Lucas's back. The key turned with a soft click. For several seconds, Lucas did not lift the door. Then he pulled. The metal rolled upward with a rattling groan, and a pocket of still air slipped out, carrying the scent of cardboard, cedar, old paper, and something faintly sweet, like the vanilla pipe tobacco Daniel used to keep sealed in a tin but never smoked. Inside were neatly stacked boxes, each labeled in Daniel's careful handwriting. Christmas, age 12. Birthday, age 13. Graduation someday. First apartment. Hard days. Open when you need courage. Lucas covered his mouth. Ethan looked away, but not before seeing the boy's knees bend under the weight of being loved so thoroughly from a distance. Frost stepped into the locker and went straight to a wooden crate at the back. He did not scratch. He only sat beside it, waiting. Lucas moved forward, wiping his face with his sleeve, and lifted the lid. Inside was a baseball glove, a stack of sealed letters, a framed photograph of Lucas as a child, and a small blue envelope resting on top. Written across the front were 4 words in Daniel's hand. For the empty chair. Lucas did not open the blue envelope right away. He held it between both hands while the merino wind moved through the storage hallway, carrying the salt of the harbor and the soft clink of boat lines tapping against metal masts. The words on the front seemed too simple for the weight inside them. For the empty chair. Ethan stood just outside the locker with Captain Ellis beside him, both men giving Lucas space without leaving him alone. Frost sat near the wooden crate, his white fur bright against the shadowed concrete, his amber eyes fixed on Lucas with the steady patience of a guardian who understood that some doors opened slower than others. The boy sank onto an overturned bucket near the boxes Daniel had labeled for all the years he had missed. Birthday gifts he never received. Letters that never found his mailbox. A life of love stored in cardboard, waiting for one brave morning and one faithful dog. Lucas drew a breath and slid one finger beneath the envelope flap. Inside was a single folded page and a photograph. The picture showed Daniel standing outside the chapel in civilian clothes, one hand resting on the back of the very front row chair, the other holding Frost's leash. The dog looked younger then, his coat clean as snow, his ears high, his eyes already carrying that deep, watchful kindness. Behind Daniel, sunlight poured through the open chapel doors. Lucas turned the photograph over. In Daniel's careful handwriting, it said, "If I cannot bring him home, Frost will." Lucas pressed the photograph to his chest and closed his eyes. Ethan felt those words move through him like a tide. He looked down at Frost, remembering the dog's urgent bark in the chapel, the way he had refused comfort, refused command, refused to let the morning pass as another ceremony with an empty seat. It had not been confusion. It had been duty. Daniel had trusted Frost with a final mission no report could explain. Lucas unfolded the letter. His voice trembled, but he read aloud because some love is too large to keep private once it has survived that long. "Lucas, if you are reading this, then I am sorry I did not make it to the day I promised. I have rehearsed this letter 100 times and still do not know how to say it right. I was not absent because I stopped loving you. I was absent because grown people sometimes make tangled roads out of simple things, and children pay the distance." Lucas paused, pressing the heel of his hand against one eye. Frost rose and moved to him, resting his chin on Lucas's knee. The boy continued, softer now. I kept every drawing you sent me. I kept the bracelet. I kept the ticket from the game where you spilled lemonade on my shoes and then tried to clean them with napkins until the third inning. That was one of the best days of my life. Captain Ellis turned away toward the marina, his jaw tight. Ethan kept still, but his throat had closed around something he could not swallow. Lucas read on. I saved a chair for you because I believed you would find your way back, even if I was not there to wave you in. And if Frost is with you, trust him. He knows the people who belong. He always has. At that, Frost gave one small breath through his nose and pressed closer. Lucas lowered the letter. For a moment, the only sound was the wind and the steady tap of halyards against sailboat masts beyond the fence. Then Lucas stood and turned toward Ethan. The boy's eyes were wet, but they were different now. Not empty, not lost, filled with the painful wonder of being remembered. He planned this, Lucas whispered. Ethan looked at the boxes, the key, the photograph, the dog waiting at Lucas's side. He hoped for it, he said. There is a difference. Planning is what people do with calendars. Hope is what they do with their whole heart. Lucas nodded slowly and looked back into the crate. Beneath the letters was a small wooden frame wrapped in brown paper. He unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a certificate from a youth aviation program Daniel had set aside, along with a savings account letter naming Lucas as the beneficiary for a modest education fund. Not riches, not a dramatic fortune, just enough for classes, books, rent, a first step. The kind of gift a quiet man would build dollar by dollar while saying nothing about it. Lucas held the paper as if it were sunlight. I wanted to study aircraft mechanics, he said. When I was little, he said engines were like people. If you listen long enough, they tell you where they hurt. Ethan smiled faintly because that sounded exactly like Daniel. Frost nudged a baseball glove from the crate, and Lucas caught it before it fell. It was worn but cared for, the leather soft, a note tucked into the palm. For when your hands need to remember joy. Lucas laughed through his tears, and the sound changed the storage locker from a place of endings into a room where life had been quietly waiting. Ethan stepped closer and placed Daniel's old bracelet beside Lucas's newer one. He saved you more than a chair, Ethan said. Lucas looked down at Frost, who leaned against him with the simple certainty of love that asks for no explanation. Outside, the clouds opened fully, and sunlight broke across the marina, lighting the wet boards, the blue doors, the harbor beyond, and the white dog who had carried a promise through grief until it reached the person it was meant to find. Lucas stepped out of the storage locker with Frost at his side, the morning sunlight now fully touching the marina, glinting off the calm water and casting long, soft shadows across the dock. He carried the notebook, the letters, the baseball glove, and the small certificate carefully in his arms, feeling the weight of all the years they represented, but also the warmth of the connection restored. Frost walked beside him, head level with Lucas, ears alert, tail moving slowly like a pendulum marking the rhythm of a heart finally at ease. Ethan followed, keeping a steady distance to give them space, but always present, the measured click of his boots against the concrete punctuating the quiet breeze. The sound of seagulls and distant boat engines filled the air, ordinary city sounds that now carried a sense of solemn joy. Lucas paused at the edge of the dock and looked out across the harbor. The water reflected the sunlight in sheets of gold and silver, each wave a gentle reminder of continuity, of life moving forward despite the losses that had marked it. Frost pressed closer, brushing against Lucas's leg, and the boy reached down to rest a hand on the dog's head, feeling the thick white fur, the warmth beneath it, the steady presence that had guided him to this moment. Ethan watched quietly, noticing how Lucas's shoulders relaxed, how the tension that had held him tight for so long had begun to melt under the soft insistence of loyalty and trust. Captain Ellis came up beside Ethan, his hands tucked lightly behind his back, his gaze shifting from Lucas to Frost and back again. He brought you here, Ethan said simply, nodding toward the dog. Captain Ellis gave a faint smile, one that carried both understanding and relief. Always does, he replied. Lucas opened the notebook again, scanning the letters and notes that Daniel had preserved. Some were brief, others filled with detailed encouragement, reminders to trust himself, to stay brave, to never forget who he was and what mattered. He read one aloud, soft and careful, so the words carried into the open air. You are never alone, Lucas. Even if the world feels distant, there is always someone who remembers. Frost lifted his head at the name, amber eyes bright, and nudged the boy's hand with his nose. Lucas smiled through tears, letting the sound travel across the dock, and Ethan felt it ripple through him, a small, undeniable pulse of hope. The young man reached into the backpack and pulled out the photograph again, holding it next to the notebook, placing the folded bracelet over the corner, and letting Frost smell the paper as if to seal the memory into something living and tangible. The air smelled of salt, sun-warmed wood, and a faint trace of Daniel's old cologne that had lingered on the pages of the letters. Lucas took a deep breath and spoke quietly, almost to himself. He made sure I would find him. Not just him, but the life he wanted me to have. Frost pressed against his side, steadying him, and Lucas realized that for the first time he truly understood what that meant. Presence beyond absence, guidance through loyalty, love manifest in quiet actions rather than grand gestures. Ethan stepped closer and offered his hand, which Lucas took without hesitation, gripping firmly but not tightly, the gesture one of grounding, of shared understanding. Frost sat back on his haunches, watching both of them, the morning sun catching his fur, turning it into a living beacon of trust and constancy. Lucas looked down at the baseball glove, ran his fingers over the leather, and whispered, "Thank you, Daniel. I will make it count." Frost wagged his tail slowly, letting the sound move through the space like a soft metronome, keeping time with the heartbeat of reconciliation and the quiet triumph of loyalty fulfilled. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's back and Lucas's shoulder at the same time, closing the circle of presence, the chain that had started years ago with service, friendship, and unwavering trust. The harbor shimmered with every ripple, the boats rocking gently, as if to nod in recognition of what had been restored, and for the first time that morning, the dock felt like a place of arrival. Rather than departure, a home not defined by walls, but by hearts that had finally met where they were always meant to.